Welcome to Seatton Education, the podcast in which we shed light on the world of home education. Today I'm speaking with award-winning writer Frank Cottrell-Boyce, who is currently the British Children's Laureate. Through this role, and his children's fiction, he encourages children to love to read. He is also a father of home-educated children. Hi Frank, thanks so much for being with me.
No, at all, it's a pleasure.
This is your life's work. Why do you think fiction and stories are important for children?
We talk a lot about how literacy and reading help with kind of educational attainment and acquiring cultural capital. But over the last few months, I've become much more concerned, globally actually, about happiness. We seem to be living through some kind of happiness recession as far as children are concerned. There's a lot. I've been visiting school for 20 years. And as I visit dozens and dozens of schools every year, and I've seen this sort of level of anxiety kind of go up. And I'm pretty sure that reading and stories they're not a fix, they're not a silver bullet, but they're a hugely valuable tool in building the apparatus of happiness inside a child, especially in the early years.
Why do you think that is?
I can give you the science because we've just been to, Denise and I have just been to visit Sam Wass's baby lab in East London, which examines, he's a neuroscientist who talks about what happens in a baby's brain when a baby is trying to make sense of the world. And if you think about a baby in the very earliest days, those first 1,000 days, it's trying to kind of navigate this overwhelming sensory experience. And his thing is that he showed us, he wired a baby up and a baby mother, he wired me up and Denise up, and showed us what happens in our brains when we're read to. And it's like a really simple thing that my takeaway from it was a very straightforward thing. Reading to a very little child slows the world down. You know, we tend to read the same stories over and over. You open a picture book, you're looking at one picture for a while. The beat of the heart is there. The tone of the voice is there. So it slows things down and it gives them, it's sort of incredibly rich bonding moments, which is both outward looking and inward looking at the same time. It was a beautiful, beautiful thing to watch. It was this is just a few months ago, and it was like one of the most kind of overwhelming experiences. It was so beautiful to watch it. And to think about what it means if you don't get that. You know, and we've always done it. We've done it since the Ice Age. We've told stories, we've sung songs, we've sung lullabies. We've had those moments where someone is in your arms and you're repeating something, you're slowing the world down for them. And of course, that little space, which is like a Promethean space, you know, that's a spark being brought to life. I think that space is under threat because I see at the school gates people giving even quite little babies a screen to watch, which is not human. And I'm not judging anybody, but just thinking about the physics and the neurology of it, that if it's really important to slow the world down for someone very little while they get their footing, then giving them something that speeds the world up is not great, you know, so that, you know, it's overwhelming enough that there's sky and leaves and wind and noise and pushchairs and other babies. And suddenly there's like Cocoa Melon and Bluey and all these other things spinning into that picture. So it feels urgent to me. It's not just important, it's urgent. And also it's not just important, it's fundamental. I think it's something about becoming human. Those moments are necessary.
Yes. It's interesting. I hadn't thought of the physical proximity as well. You touched on it there, that actually when you're reading a book, books are a certain size. They're not TV sized. So you have to be sitting close to a child.
That's a really good point.
To do it.
That's really, really good. Yeah, and actually you might both end up holding it.
Yeah.
You know, so there's something very shared about that. Yeah, that's really good. And of course, if that I'm educationally, this is an education podcast, so educationally, if your first experience of a book is going to school and being given this alien piece of tech and told to interpret it or decode it, then that's obviously very different if your first experience of a book is cuddled up under a duvet with
Yeah.
and that book becoming familiar as opposed to boring. I'm kind of working on
I
that
do.
distinction in my head, but like I've read
Mm.
to one of my granddaughters, I've read Dear Zoo, I think about 100 times now, and we act it out.
Yeah.
That's very different from having to read a reading scheme book over and over and over until you're allowed to read the next book.
Yeah, it's a very good point, because I think we focus a lot on the worrying literacy dearth amongst children in the UK at the moment. But I think we don't focus perhaps on there is a lot of data as well. I think the Book Trust just did a survey saying that less than 50% of children now say they enjoy reading for pleasure, which that's actually more worrying, I would say, than the literacy issue, because that's a whole cultural piece that might be lost.
100%, and I think there's something in maybe British culture or Northern European culture that's sort of dismissive of the idea of pleasure. That
Yeah,
sort of doesn't
interesting.
matter if you can function. So actually, British school children score quite highly in terms of functional literacy, but they're right at the very bottom of the table when it comes to reading for pleasure, right? And so we're teaching them all the steps and naming all the tunes, but they're not dancing, so that's bad anyway.
Yeah.
But also, I think we need to lean into like what is the definition of pleasure? Pleasure's not the same as distraction or fun. Pleasure, I think of pleasure as the deepest form of attention. Pleasure is, if you take pleasure in something, you're locking it into your brain for the longest time, and you're bringing all the different thought functions that you have to bear on it. So if you read the life of any great scientist, it always starts with pleasure. Kepler's mum.
Yeah.
Let's talk about mums. Kepler's mum, who effectively ran a pub, used to take him out whenever there was a really bright sky to look at the stars, and he became Kepler. But when Kepler, who was nearly blind, and this is pre-telescope astronomy.
Yes.
When he went out to look at, study or listen about the stars, he was thinking about his mum as well. That's what pleasure is. Pleasure is something that really implants something. It's the deepest form of attention. I think that's what. So when we say we're not reading for pleasure, that means they're not reading with attention. They're not absorbing what they're reading.
I think as well it touches on a broader question of, very broad question, but what is the purpose of life? If it is just efficiency and ticking things off, I mean, is that really where we want to
100%.
get to?
And I think that's always been a question, but I think it's more a question. It's a bigger and more urgent and more important question at moments of huge change. So when we talk about functionality of literature, functional reading, we have no idea what function our children will have to perform. The world is just like we have at the moment. We are preparing children for a world that we know nothing about. We have no idea what really fundamental things, like we certainly have no idea what work is going to look like in even 5-10 years' time. By the time these children leave school, we have no idea what work is going to look like. We have no idea how, as humans, we're going to address AI. AI is as big. AI is as big as printing. It's as big as the Industrial Revolution. It's a huge shift, and we have no clue how we're going to deal with that. And if you look how we struggled to come to terms with the Industrial Revolution, we didn't know that children weren't supposed to be components in a power loom because children had always worked. We didn't know that this was different. All these sort of big questions that we have no clue what world we're sending those children into. But we do know that they'll need to find pleasure in it. And we do know that they need to be happy. Because if you're not happy, then you've got no resilience to what's going on, So, I'm not at all saying reading cures it, but I'm saying that's a big, very, very accessible, very flexible, very joyful tool that we have had since the Ice Age. Why would we put it down?
Yes.
But we are putting it down.
And how do we get that back? If you have a child who is very resistant, they say, I hate reading. What can parents do to instill a love of learning?
But I think that thing of, I hate reading, that I think a lot of that comes from encountering it late. You know, if 50% of kids are not encountering reading till they go to school, then yes, obviously they're not going to love it. It's part of school, you know, and it's something being taught. Whereas if it's you can't teach pleasure. You can only share pleasure. You know, so we have to start early. I think that's the thing. You know, on a happy note, you know, I've been going around all these different settings these last 6 months. I've been to, you know, the charred remains of Sure Start centres, family hubs, health visitors, prisons. I've been to a maximum security prison for children, and looked at how it works in those settings. The infrastructure's there. Health visitors have known this for a really long time, and health visitors do the job, but it's very, very patchy. So I'm quite hopeful that we can address this. You know, that if we can make people as aware of the value of being read to, as opposed to the value of learning to read, then I mean, like, that's a side thing. But like, if we can harness the infrastructure that's there, spotlight it, praise it, make it grow a bit. You know, all the health visitors I've spoken to. As an aside, by the way, like I've spoken to lots of different groups of professional people. Health visitors are the only group of professionals in the country who are really happy. They love their job. They do it for 50 years. They get promoted and then step back down again. They love it, you know, but there aren't enough of them. So I think it's kind of there is, obviously you can't fix it, but you can definitely improve the situation. And I think if we can really, really emphasize culturally early years, which we don't, not just in educationally, but in any way. Children are just not in the national conversation. If we can do that, I think we can make an enormous difference. And I think part of that is separating literacy from reading. You know, I think because why? You know what I mean? I think about some of the great minds of the world. Saint Augustine, right? You sit down and read very much. He was read to a lot. There's a brilliant passage in the Confessions where it's very clear that he's seeing someone reading to themselves for the first time in his life. St. Ambrose is sitting there and he's got this passage in the Confessions where he's going, and he didn't move his lips, he wasn't talking to anyone, he was just like taking the words into his head, couldn't figure it out, what was going on? And he's absolutely confused. But this is someone who's like the part of the intellectual apparatus of Europe. He had not read to himself ever in his life till he was in his 30s or whatever, you know. So that the presence, the idea of being read to, is a really, 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 really important step in the process of learning, but also in the process of becoming a human. I think that's a thing that we need to talk about. And of course, if you're home educated, absolutely beautifully placed to do that. You can spend all day reading to each other.
No. I want to pick up more on that, but I think it's useful because this is culturally so normalized for us. I think it's useful to think of an analogy in a different field or a comparison, because it's sort of like if you said to children, before you can look at any great painting, you've got to sit down and learn how to draw pen and ink and how to use watercolours and the science of mixing colours before you're allowed to look at any pictures, which would be crazy, obviously. We don't do 100%. That at all.
And if you think of any dad...
we do see that distinction.
Yeah, and any dad would, you know, if you said to any dad, you must not play football with your kid till they fully understand the offside rule,
the rules,
and a little bit about ballistics, you know, it's like, what? No, that's not how it works. Or you're not going to eat until you can cook.
Yeah. The reason I make that point is I think people do completely swallow the reading and literacy are the same thing pill without sense checking it.
It makes sense. Or, you know, checking it against their own experience. You know, who's going to open the box if they don't know it's a box of delights?
Yeah, absolutely. And if you have a child who says, well, I like reading, I don't know, this kind of fantasy novel, but I don't want to read another genre, is that a problem? And how do you encourage them to read books they haven't read before?
I wanted to be dismissive of it because that's what writers and people always say, oh, read whatever you like. But I do have to say, like, this is just anecdotal, and I don't really know where I'm going with this. But I see kids who, are encouraged to read Jeff Kinney, Wimpy Kid, blah blah blah, all those like books, which I love, and there are books in that field where, we're like kind of interim stage where they're not picture books, but they're very heavily illustrated. So Wimpy Kid is one, Loki is another, and Grimwood, and those books are all brilliant. But if you're not moving on from them, do you know what I mean? If you're still saying Wimpy Kid's your favourite book when you're 10, I don't want to be pushy about how you should move forward. It's like, there is some analogy with your food thing there. It's like when you're still only eating fish fingers, like part of reading, we live it. We've created a world in which kids are very sheltered from risk. We're very risk averse. There's that great Jonathan Haidt line about children are vastly oversupervised in the real world and totally unsupervised online.
Yeah, exactly.
So I think reading is somewhere you can take a risk. I don't know. Like in terms of home education, it's simple, isn't it? You just say, no, I want you to try this and cuddle up and read this book that you haven't read, But it's not that thing of like, you don't necessarily have to be progressing towards Dostoevsky. And I really don't... I think people place a huge value on fiction and less value on fact books. But like, I don't... fact books can be just as challenging and just as enriching. I think it's all there. Why would you limit any of it,
Yeah, and you've touched on home education. As I mentioned before, your wife and you some of your children have been home educated. Can we weave into maybe your experience of how can we build in literature and reading into a home setting?
I know you're going to talk to Denise, and Denise was the home educator. I think my only contribution to that was that it was nice to have another adult in the house, which is an enormous privilege, and but it was definitely her project, and I loved it. From the point of view of reading, I think they just read a lot. That's what they did. I mean, I think one thing that inhibits reading in school is that shade into writing, isn't it? It's like seems like a strange thing for a writer to say. I think we write too much in school, a lot too much. Because you go out into the world of work, you write well, there's a kind of writing that you do, which is sending absolutely meaningless and redundant emails to each other. But if you're in a project, but if you're in a project that's really kind of quite demanding, like, I make films, and for 8 weeks when you're making a movie, it is absolutely overwhelming. And you're juggling everything from, petty cash to huge pieces of engineering to temperamental actors to weather, all those things are happening at the same time. Like, I've worked with great film directors, say Danny Boyle, a great film director, did the Olympic opening ceremony together. Very rarely saw him with a pen or a notebook. He's a brilliant listener, And I think we spend too much time writing stuff down and not enough time listening. So I think the more central reading to each other is, the better, because your listening skill is vastly more, unless you're Dostoevsky, your listening ability is massively more important than your writing ability. Being able to remember what people have said and listening properly to what people have said. I think that's a skill that's vastly undervalued, and that, again, in home you can really kind of foster that. We don't foster that skill in schools.
No.
Because of force of number.
There is research on this. Yes, exactly. There is research on this that actually as well, if you hone that listening skill, your retention is much better. I always joke that the minute you get your pen out, it's almost like you forget to remember it because you think, well, I've written it down, so I don't need to remember it.
Yeah,
whereas
or
there's
worse,
a lot of evidence.
If you get your laptop out, then you're definitely never going to remember
it. But I always think back to Homer and bards throughout history, that they remembered these huge tomes because they'd remember lyrical hooks that would remind them where they were, and it would be repetition, and you'd say, and I remember studying Homer and thinking, how on earth did him or any other bard reciting those tales remember it all? But I think if you're practicing and you're listening to the lyric quality of words you're used to reading aloud and listening aloud. It's a skill that we have lost, and I think retention, this is borne out by the data that retention is much better when you hone that listening skill
Massively,
rather than just immediately go to type it up.
And also, it's better if you read your retention is better if you read a physical book than if you read online, or you read, which is definitely true, because I take my Kindle everywhere because I read a lot and it's unbulky. But I find myself in conversations where someone's recommending a book and 5 minutes in I go, oh yeah, I have read it. And I'm sure it's because, but if I've read it as a physical book, because our memory is sticky, I think we undervalue the complexity of memory. So we talk a lot about remembering data or remembering lines, but we never really talk about remembering voices, feel, smell, all the other things that help anchor a memory. And that goes back to why it's important to read to early years, because you're anchoring that experience in the smell of your mum, the smell of your duvet, the smell of the cooking, the sound of the birds outside the window, or the trains, or the traffic, or your environment is pulled into that experience.
And I think that's a good point, because even personally, I love reading too, and I remember a book story or message or whatever the author is intending you to remember from it as much or intermingled with what the book felt like, how thick the pages were, what the smell was, how heavy it was, what the cover illustration was, because it's a sensory experience reading a book rather than just flicking and it's all the same type font and you just have, that's the action you do.
And we should lean into that. It's very valuable. I mean, my dad had dementia for a very long time, and for a lot of that time, he had no idea where he was. He didn't really recognize me. Like very ordinary. He sometimes didn't know what his hand was. But if I read to him, I mean, he didn't follow the story, but we were in the same space and time. Whereas he was often completely fragmented and floated through the universe. With the call of my voice. So your voice has associations that are not just to do with passing on stories or information or jokes. They're an imprint of you. And I think the physical book has a similar property. I've got books that I had when I was 5 and 6 years old, just a few of them that fall into pieces. I don't really need to read them again. But if I take them down and hold them, you're
transported.
And there's a desire path back to these happy memories that the book has blazed that track for me, hasn't it?
And also, we should note, I don't want to, put writers out of work, but also the value of oral storytelling is dramatically lost in modern society.
I mean, that's the core of what I'm saying, really, that your voice is a massively important thing, and your presence is a massively important thing, and that ties everything together. Listening is more important than writing. Reading to each other is every bit as important as reading alone. Yes, when you read alone, that's great. You're getting all kinds of cultural capital, and you're getting, you're slowing your own body down and all that stuff. It's all wonderful. But being read to, I mean, all my most important reading experiences are shared, all of them. The most vivid ones from my own childhood, but actually from my kids' childhood as well. Reading just William to them, or reading. Actually, I read Lord of the Rings to the boys. They're really big emotional anchoring experiences.
Yes, absolutely. Well, I think you've made the case perfectly for reading for pleasure for children, and I am very touched that you shared it with me today. So thank you, Frank, for your time.
It's a real joy, actually. I really enjoyed this. Thank you.
And thank you so much for joining Seatton Education today. Please do leave a comment and subscribe, as I really love to hear from you and hear your stories with your children and families. For more information, go to seatton.com, and I'll see you next time.